And our focus is trying to work with developers and other building owners early on in building projects to figure out how they can reach their sustainability goals and energy efficiency goals and make those decisions up front in that design process. And as we go through my presentation here, that's an important place to be when you're talking about sustainability and energy efficiency. So we're going to use a project that is it's about 95% completed in terms of construction right now. It's located in Palo Alto, California. And this project is aiming for net zero electric energy. So they do have gas for heating, but they're offsetting all of their building electricity uses, as well as 13 car chargers in the parking garage with photovoltaics. So I'll work through a few different topics here. I'm going to start with the process on net zero and then go into a lot of the building design elements and finish up talking about PV. You may have seen something like this before. The basic way to get to a net zero energy building is to start with the building envelope, start with the orientation on the site, make that as inherently energy efficient as possible, and then look at the lighting and daylighting. Lighting is still a pretty big energy user in buildings today. And then the last thing is typically to move to looking at efficient HVAC systems. In this case, on this project, we used a product called a thermofuser, and I'll get into that later. And then finally, you size your rooftop photovoltaic array to generate the amount of electricity you use during a year. In terms of what we do, there's a lot going on this graph, but the basic thing I want you to take away is that early in design, and even earlier than that in pre-design, that's when these big decisions need to be made. So building orientation has a huge impact on building energy use and energy efficiency. You can't change the orientation of the building typically past about concept or schematic design. Often even by then it'll be fixed. As you get further into your design process, the energy efficiency impact of different design changes reduces and the cost increment for those changes goes up. So you want to be occupying the pre-design, concept design phases when we're talking about a highly energy efficient building. We'll also talk about, or I'll talk about cost a little bit in this presentation. On this project, we moved a lot of the cost into the architectural systems. So we have sun shading, we have highly insulated walls, we have high performance double pane glazing, and that allowed us to reduce our mechanical equipment sizes, also allowed us to reduce some of the electrical that would have been required for more lighting. So I'll move on into massing and orientation, and I'm going to move quickly here so we can also have time for questions at the end. But as Rob said, if you have a question, just let him know and we'll answer it on the way. So basic theory on massing and orientation. The higher your surface area to volume ratio is, the poorer your building will perform in terms of energy efficiency. And so these are just some basic block shapes of a building and how they'll perform. In general, we're probably closer to the 1.2 building type on this project. We did a lot of site plan and orientation studies. We were really trying to figure out how to orient the building more true to solar north. So the site, these studies are actually angled correctly, so north is up. But you can see the street grid preferences the site to actually be a little bit, I think it's about 25 degrees off north. So we looked at all these different options to see if we could make the building a little more oriented, better for solar. We didn't really get there. The building remained aligned to the street grid. As you can see, after about a year and a couple of months of studies, we basically had a very similar building to the one that we had before. But again, it's that process that we get to be a part of early on in the design process that can help inform the energy efficiency decisions on the building project itself. Another thing we looked at was width of floor plate and the opportunity for daylighting. So the 2013 Title 24 Energy Code in California now requires dimmable lights and automatic dimming based on daylight sensors, so photosensors. And this project, we were trying to see okay, how wide can this building be before we start to lose a lot of the impact of the daylighting that we've worked so hard on the facade? And I think we ended up with about this 100-foot wide floor plate. I think that's about where we are. So there's some trade-off between a narrow building costs more to build because you have more skin, and a wider building is cheaper, but the narrow building will perform better in terms of daylight and energy savings. So that's actually a pretty good lead-in to envelope. I always like to start with this slide. I work in Oakland. I live in Oakland as well. These two buildings are in downtown Oakland, and they're literally across the street from each other. The one on the right was designed and built before we had air conditioning systems, and the one on the left was designed and built after we had air conditioning systems. So the building on the right performs passively up to probably an 80 or 85 degree day. That's about as hot as it gets in Oakland. And the building on the left, you're pumping air conditioning into that building probably year-round because of the solar gains on that facade. So as much as possible, we want to drive the building design to the option shown on the right. It's a continuum, so we're somewhere in between, and people don't want to build. People like all glass buildings, so there's negotiation and there's trade-offs to try to get to a building that performs like the one on the right, but somehow looks and gives the same architectural feel to the one on the left. In this case, we looked at several different design options in terms of wall insulation, window type, and we looked at what that does to our cooling equipment capacity. So cooling equipment doesn't come in 1-ton increments from 0 to 1,000 tons, right? It's you have these kind of buckets where you have to, once you get above a certain point, you need to buy potentially a much larger piece of equipment. So this was a quick study we did that showed the baseline actually is triple pane windows. So going from triple to double moves us up 2 equipment sizes. Having an R24 wall moves us down below the equipment size we were at before. And these are things that help the cost implications on the project and help shift that money from the mechanical systems into the architectural systems and help the project come in at the budget that they're trying to hit. We also studied thermal comfort. So this is the west-facing facade. It's a bit south of west, so it's not a great facade in terms of solar orientation. We looked at the predicted percent dissatisfied over a year-long period with triple pane and then also with double pane. And predicted percent dissatisfied is a descriptor. It's based on a lot of different factors in the space, and it's trying to determine how many people in your building will be happy, thermally comfortable at different hours during the year. And the red dashed line at 5%, generally people say you can't really get better than 5% of your people being happy or being unhappy. There will always be 5% of folks that aren't happy no matter what thermal comfort conditions are. So we try to keep our thermal comfort at that level. And as you can see, going from triple pane to double pane glazing on the project has a much bigger impact on thermal comfort. And in fact, I don't have the energy results up here as well. Then it has a bigger impact on thermal comfort than it does on energy in this case. So that was a conversation that we had. In the end, triple pane was just too expensive, and we stuck with double pane. But it's another thing to consider. Beyond energy, beyond having a net zero building, what's the experience of people inside the space? And often to someone like a developer, that's a more compelling case. How are the office workers or the other tenants going to feel in the space? And are they going to stay there, or will the developer have to keep renting the space to new tenants because they're not happy in the space? So all this study helped inform what became this shading story as you go around the building. And I have a few photos or renderings of the building that will illustrate this more. But on the east facade, we have more of a vertical shading emphasis, as well as on the west facade. On the south facade, we have a horizontal shading emphasis. And on the north facade, there's no shading at all. And this was all based on the calculations and the studies that we did. And we determined exactly what kind of, how deep, how long, how wide shades do we need. So the building reads very clearly what's going on in terms of solar control. So this is the north facade. Shading is very limited. There are a few statements. The brow allows the building to be unified. This is the east-facing facade. It actually has horizontal as well as vertical louvers in this case. The south-facing facade, this is a little zoomed back, but you can see that it's primarily this long, relatively deep band of horizontal shading. And the vertical louvers are much shallower. They're pronounced in order to give the architecture a unified feel, but they're really not doing any work on the south facade. And then on the west facade, we've actually punched in the windows for the most part. So we've set them back 18 inches. We've also narrowed the windows because on the west facade, once the sun comes down in the afternoon, there's just nothing you can do about the glare and the heat coming through that window on a summer day when it's already hot because it's afternoon. So we made the decision to narrow those windows by a foot as compared to the rest of the windows around the building, and we also set them back into the facade, so more of a punched opening approach. So the building itself reads as you walk around, and it tells the story of how solar is controlled and how daylighting is handled around the building. So all of that comes before HVAC, and I'm a mechanical engineer, so HVAC is kind of the most interesting part for me. But at the end of the day, we come last if the building is designed correctly. So I'm going to get into a few general efficiency concepts on HVAC. Thermal comfort, which I was talking about before, it's influenced by several different things. Convection, so that's air temp as well as air speed. So if you turn on a fan, you feel a little more comfortable. That's convection. Evaporation, so that's sweating and losing heat via evaporation, influenced by relative humidity in the space. And then radiation. So you're actually a warm body and you're radiating, in most cases, to cooler surfaces around you. If all of the building structure is warm, then that's actually radiating heat to you. So all three of these components are important when we talk about HVAC systems, because our ultimate goal is thermal comfort, and our secondary goal is delivering thermal comfort with extremely high energy efficiency.
Hey, Chris.
Often, yeah.
There was a quick question here related to thermal comfort, actually. Troy was asking, when you were talking earlier about percent people dissatisfied, so he says, you mentioned that the estimation of PPD is having been related to the hours of occupants in discomfort. Is that predicated on a certain number of temperature or humidity degrees away from a seasonal baseline?
That's a great question. So in that case, we were actually looking at glare, so visual comfort, as well as just solar gain on the window, so radiation discomfort. So even though the air temperature in the space is maintained at about 74 degrees on a summer day by the HVAC system, the window surface warms up. And you feel that, and you're uncomfortable even though the space is technically cooled by HVAC standards. So that's what we were looking at in those two graphs.
Great, thanks.
All right, cool. So there's two ways in general that we can deliver heating and cooling to a building. One is via air. The other way is via water, hydronic heating and cooling. I love this photo. It just shows the heat capacity of air relative to water. And we'll get into what this means, but it just gives you a sense of you have to push a lot more air in terms of volume through your building to get the same amount of heating or cooling as you do water. So what this results in is a 3/4 horsepower fan will do the same amount of cooling work, for example, as a 1/10 horsepower pump. So in terms of energy, that's a pretty big win. So whenever we can convince the building owner and the project team to move to hydronic cooling systems, such as radiant cooling, potentially chilled beam cooling, other systems like that, it's a win for the building in terms of energy efficiency. These systems also usually produce better thermal comfort because you're cooling or heating surfaces in the building, and so you have that sensation of radiation comfort, and it's actually matching what you need based on the season. One other idea is low pressure drop design. That boils down to larger ducts and larger pipes and smoother duct runs and smoother pipe runs. And if you maintain that through the whole design, you can use a smaller fan or a smaller pump to do the same amount of cooling that in a typical conventional system you may need a 2 or 3 size upsize to do that. This is pretty straightforward. It costs a little more for the increase in duct sizes and pipe sizes. That's usually offset by the energy efficiency savings. So in terms of actual system selection for this project, again, I'll come back to this graph that we transferred a lot of the cost to the architecture out of the mechanical. And we also followed this approach on the right. In order to save costs, we invested in the envelope. So we're a quote-unquote low-tech HVAC system. Controls are cheaper, equipment is cheaper. You don't have to invest as much in the moving parts, the mechanical equipment. And that generally holds true for almost any project. Labs and clean rooms may be a little different. So one of the options we looked at for HVAC used this distribution system called chilled beams, and those are terminal units that are placed in every space, and hot or cold water is pumped through those units, and they induce room air up through a coil, and they cool the space in that manner. They also have a small radiant surface. This is highly efficient. It's hydronic based. It provides really great comfort. Provides excellent control. This is the first system we looked at. As you can see, there are a lot of things on this diagram. It's costly. The second system we looked at uses a diffuser called a thermofuser. It's a variable air volume diffuser. So your ability to control air volume to a space actually occurs at each diffuser. So everywhere you have a diffuser, you have a zone of thermal control. So it provides a lot of thermal comfort for an air system. It can be relatively efficient for an air system because you need a low pressure drop duct design for this system to work. And as you can see, it's much less equipment intensive. At the end of the day, the choice was made based on the cost premium. So we were getting estimates for the chill beam system that ran from around $5 million ad. And the savings in terms of energy did not pay back for that upcharge. And this was a developer-driven project. So it was a pretty easy decision for them, even though we fought hard for the chilled beam system. But because of the approach we took to invest in the envelope, we could use the thermofuser system and still have an efficient building. And this is something that we're replicating in other developer-driven projects. We're moving the cost, as I've already said, into the architecture to save energy passively, and then our mechanical systems can get smaller and they can get simpler. All right, I'll jump into water very briefly. So we don't have any reclaimed rainwater or gray water reuse on this project, but there is a proposal by the City of Palo Alto to extend their reclaimed water pipeline right up the street that this project is located on. Unfortunately, construction was originally supposed to begin on that phase of the reclaimed water pipeline in 2012. It's been pushed back to 2018. Still, Palo Alto has required the building to be dual plumbed, so when recycled water does come down the street, the building can connect to that and use recycled water to flush toilets and for irrigation. I'll move through this really quickly, but in general, we're coming in from the street. When that recycled water line comes up, we'll be using that for toilet flushing and irrigation. It also has an impact on lead. Sorry, was that a question, or am I just hearing an echo?
No, I unmuted myself, Chris, because there was another question here about the chilled beams, actually.
Okay.
You mentioned that as a, well, I'm going to add a little bit to this question myself. You said it was a developer-driven project, so eventually the chilled beams got value engineered out or too expensive. So if you could explain a little bit about what you mean by a developer-driven project, that would be great. But also the question was, what's the most expensive component of that chilled beam system? Why was the cost so high?
Okay, that's a great question. So I'll start with a developer-driven project. Generally what that means to us is the building has to be built at market rate. So it's different from maybe a project that is put out by a foundation or a university where they aren't constrained by getting a certain rent for their space, and their primary goal isn't to make money. So a developer-driven project, primary goal is to make money. They don't want to spend an extra dollar on the project, and they want to get it in under this price line so their rent can pay them back in a certain amount of time. The chilled beam system, in short, everything here is expensive. In comparison, we only have an air handler and these diffusers in the thermofuser system. Here we have an air handler, and then we have more expensive diffusers. Those are the chilled beams. And then on top of that, we have a chiller, a cooling tower, a heat pump for heating, and chilled water storage and hot water storage. So all of those extra hot water and cold water generating pieces of equipment add to cost. Those are the primary driver of cost. The chilled beams are more expensive than the thermofusers, so those add cost as well. But what you're building is a central plant to generate hot water and cold water to keep the building comfortable. That's the primary cost driver. And this was actually studied when the project was twice as big. So the project as built is about 89,000 square feet. It started off as 180,000 square feet, but was reduced due to a couple of decisions that were made. So on larger projects, the chilled water plant or the hot water plant actually makes more sense. On smaller projects, it's harder to get it to pencil out. So I'll jump back in on water. Couple impacts on LEED for water. We were able to claim that we'll use the reclaimed water when it comes down the street, so that allows us to grab some points. And then in terms of the building construction requirements, we need a dual pipe for toilet flushing and trap priming. All right, lighting and daylighting. Looks like I don't have too much more time, so I'm going to move quickly here. General concepts. Our building is shaded, so we get the low sun angle in the winter when the impact of solar gain isn't as problematic, and we avoid the solar gain, direct solar gain, in the summer when it's more problematic to have heat coming in through your windows. We also took an approach that is usually termed low ambient plus task lighting in terms of lighting design. So your ambient lighting system, that would be the system that's on the ceiling providing a general light level to the whole space. It's designed for about 30-foot candles. Typical design of ambient lighting systems is anywhere from 60 to 100-foot candles. And then you provide task lighting on the desks so people have light for detailed tasks that they need a little more illumination for. In general, this allows you to have a more energy efficient lighting system because the task lights are only turned on when necessary, as opposed to pushing that task illumination into the ambient system where it would always be on. So we're kind of taking the task illumination out of ambient lighting where it would typically be on a project, and we're putting it on the desk. We also looked at daylighting, and we did lots of studies on daylighting. I think the next slide is actually a little more informative. We looked at how much daylight penetration can we get and how much day lighting will we have in the space at different times during the year. And we tuned the external sunshades to block the direct sun, but allow in, excuse me, enough light to daylight the space during the day so you can turn off your lights. The challenge, if you don't have exterior shading, is when the sun is on the glass, when it's directly hitting the glass, it's too bright. And so people will pull down their shades, which will then make it too dark so that the lights will come on if you have daylight control. So exterior shading allows us to take highest advantage of automatic daylight sensors and hopefully avoid having those shades come down as much as possible. So the last thing in terms of net zero energy is looking at your photovoltaics. You've spent a lot of time making the building efficient. So now what do we need to do to get the PV on the roof? In terms of LEED, you can grab a lot of points from a PV array. So just from the PV points, we got 13 points, that can get you from gold to platinum. It's a good bump. For this project, we were able to take advantage of plummeting photovoltaic panel costs, and that actually made the system much more financially viable, to the point where 2 to 3 months before construction, and even during construction, the owner was calling us and saying, how much more PV can we put on the building? My ROI is looking great, and I want to maximize that investment. So here are a few options we looked at for the owner. One is an upfront purchase. In that case, the owner would have to take advantage of tax credits and incentives. Second option is a power purchase agreement. So the owner is actually buying electricity, and in this case, it would be the tenant buying electricity from a company that puts the panels up on the roof and then sells the electricity. The third is a lease approach. And in this case, the leasing company buys the system and installs it, and then the owner leases that system for 7 years and then can buy back in year 8 for 20% of the original system cost. The beauty of this approach is during the first 5 to 10 years of building operation, the owner has no tax liability because that building is depreciating, and so they don't have a profit. Unless you're a large real estate developer and you're generating a lot of profit from other buildings, usually for a while after you've built the building, you don't have tax liability. So on this project, they went with a lease option. This allows someone to take advantage of 30% tax credit, and then after 7 years, the owner will buy the system back, and they'll have the system outright after that point. All right, so that's it. Any other questions?
Yeah, I think we've got time for 1 or maybe 2 questions here. I see one here from Matt, and going off of the solar, so Matt has a little bit of background. I know works at is an intern at the SFPUC this summer, Chris, which I'm sure you know very well. But yeah, regarding the solar, you mentioned the really nice return on investment. How much of that is because of the tax credits? And as those potentially disappear, will that ROI start to change?
The answer is yes, the ROI changes, mainly for the cash purchase option. It does impact the lease because the leasing company will make you buy the system back for more after 7 years. So that 20% might be 40% in year 8. So we actually did a study for a 750,000 square foot development in Sunnyvale, and the return on investment with the 30% credit was, I think it was in the low teens, like 13 or 14%. And with the 10% credit, it dropped, and I may be not remembering exactly, it dropped, I think, in the 5 or 6 or 7% range. So it's a pretty big hit, and it does make an impact.
Awesome. Well, thanks. Well, looking at the time here, I think we ought to switch gears to Mark's presentation too. But Chris, thank you so much for sharing with us. It's a fantastic project and a really good example of some of the things we talked about last week.
Oh, great. Happy to do it. So
yeah,
I need to share this back with you, or do you have control to do that, Rob?
I have control to switch things over to Mark, so we're just going to go ahead and do that. Mark,
all right.
Mark, you have the screen now. You have the presentation. If you want to unmute yourself and say hello to everyone.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for having me. Chris, that was a great presentation. I have a background as a building scientist, and you hit all some nice high points really quickly and covered a lot of ground. Let me see if I can get that around there so it's less glary. So my background's pretty varied. I started out as a solar guy back in the last century and had companies both in solar thermal and solar electric. And then I got involved more in residential construction and looking at a lot of alternative construction techniques. So I've been fortunate enough to build with Cobb and worked on the first 2-story straw bale building that was done to code in California. And lots of other fun and various things, many of them quote-unquote outlaw buildings because you can't really play in the code without getting yourself into trouble with some of these alternative materials, as we say. So I wanted to just touch base on a couple of things here. Let me get myself out of the way if I can. So let's see. So is that all coming through okay there, Rob?
Yeah, everything's great. We can see you. We can hear you. Perfect.
Okay, great. So this is where Rob and I first met. This is at the Solar Decathlon 2 years ago almost, and I highly encourage all of you to go this fall and see some of these houses. There's a pretty famous building scientist by the name of Joe Steebrook. He's a leading expert witness on failures of buildings, and he says that the Solar Decathlon, for that 2 weeks that it's there, is the finest group of residential buildings on the planet. And I'd have to agree. And so you can learn a lot by just going and browsing and seeing some of these, and being able to talk to some of the folks who have been on these various teams, like Rob was. And it was a lot of fun to be there on site and actually help them put that all together. A lot of my focus in the last couple of years has been on the small house movement and the tiny house movement. And so I've been fortunate enough again to work with great people. In this case, it was a guy by the name of Shafer, who's considered sort of the guru of the tiny house movement. He's been on Oprah a couple of times and has become somewhat famous for his work in that world. Jay is a really fabulous designer. And so I want to talk a little bit about design and how it plays into all of this, because I come from a building science and construction background, so I'm always about the stuff and the number crunching and how it all works. Jay is all about how a building feels to the occupants. He uses a lot of sacred geometry, Fibonacci sequence, things of that sort to do his design work. And his buildings feel very different when you're in them. You all have gotten a little exposure to passive solar design, and so these things are all kind of like the ancient design principles that have been around forever. And so marrying that with modern materials and modern engineering is really a sweet place to be, and you all get to play with that quite a bit. The thing I like most about the small house movement is that it allows people to have control over their building process and the place that they live. And I think we've gotten way out there in regards to that. Even a century ago, people used to get together and do barn raisings and things of that nature. And I think now there's, with the maker movement and the tiny house movement, there's a lot more of that sort of let's all help each other build something kind of feel and energy, which is really a lot of fun. And so this is the book that Jay wrote, the Small House book, and it's still a beauty. It's about 10 years old now, and it's a great piece that just really lays out the basis of his design principles and how he went about it. And then it also has a lot of other handy things. You get, let's see there. You can get an e-copy of it pretty readily. Some of the other things that have big influences on me as far as my design mentality were a thing called the pattern language, which is a series of books in combination with another one called A Timeless Way of Building. Pattern language was 253 patterns that seem to come up in no matter what the culture, what the part of the world is, what the climate they're building in, and they sort of key into each other and relate to one another. So if you have a small courtyard, it might then relate to other patterns that might be like an entryway or a fountain or something like that. So it's all these pieces that kind of key together, and it's a really fun thing to be able to play around with that and look through that book, and it's a pair of books in combination. So the let's see. With the tiny house world, a lot of fun things are getting done by people. And again, it's about scale and size and what do you really need to be happy. And so one of my projects right now is I'm designing and going to build a tiny house for myself that is a lot like the solar Decathlon houses, all electric, totally zero energy. And I always start with, you know, a good thermal envelope, like Chris was talking about. With you get that out, that thermal envelope done really well, it allows you more flexibility, and maybe you'd be able to do something like the chilled beams, which I think are fascinating technology, and I'd love to see more of those things get adopted. But it's tough when you're playing in the hard economic world. The nice thing about the tiny house movement is it allows people to have a little bit more flexibility, to be able to do things at their own pace, to be able to scavenge and salvage materials, and frankly, you don't have to do it to the code, but you still want to be safe and realistic. So it's letting people have a little bit more power about how they shelter themselves. And shelter is so important, and we forget about how many people are in a homeless or under-sheltered situation. And I think this is an answer to a lot of those things. And then extrapolating out into on more of a global scale, most people don't get the luxury of the square footage that we have and all the kinds of things that we get to play with in this culture. So when you start looking at small scales, if you go out and do things in other countries, look at the small structures and look at the things that really work for people, and incorporate those into your designs. And then again, with the scale, the thing I like about the tiny house movement, the thing that's being talked a lot about now is where do you put them? And we're sort of creating new ground, literally, by looking at how do we live together in small houses, in community, and be able to share common space. We don't all have to have, you know, I like having a nice big workshop. I've been a farmer too, so I like having barns and equipment and all those kinds of things. But if you share those with 10, 20, 30 other people, it makes it a lot more cost effective and a lot more, it gets to be easier, to be more fun to do these things with others who have common interest. And so by tiny house, we generally talk about really tiny things. Like Jay's original house was 98 square feet. And then he did one about 120. You'll find the sweet spot for some of these structures if you don't want to deal too much with the powers that be. And part of the reason that we put them on trailers a lot is to stay in what I call the gray zone. And so it's a temporary structure if it's on a trailer. So that actually puts you into a different set of rules, more like RV. And again, you don't have to go and pull permits and have inspections. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't be safe. You should still do things like plumb and electric. Get an electrician to do your electricity. Have a plumber work with you. And it's a way to actually engage with these tradespeople and be able to learn skills yourself that you can help other people and build on your own skill set. That sort of influenced me early on in my life, and I just went from basically from trade to trade, apprenticing and taking the bottom level job just to be able to learn about what was going on and how to speak the language and put pieces together. And it's been a lot of fun for me to be able to put all that in one spot and start doing all the different pieces that you get to do in a tiny house. And the nice thing is you do get to do everything if you want. So it's a nice building block. It doesn't even have to be a complete house. What we talk a lot about now is just doing your own extra room, which then can be added onto or ganged with others and combined with decks and canopies, and to make a really nice indoor-outdoor space. I live up in a more rural area up in Sonoma County, and so there's a lot of this going on. It's kind of the hotbed of it right now because Jay lives up here and several other tiny house aficionados have gravitated to Sonoma County as well. So we're getting to have a lot of fun sort of under the radar while still trying to create a village and do things like that. The beauty of the tiny house things is, again, the hands-on, the ownership it gives people. It's something that a lot of people in the lower income brackets don't get to have. It's really challenging in our society right now to get into a structure and have a roof over your head, which changes your whole life in a lot of ways. I have several friends. One in particular was a Vietnam vet who had a lot of trouble readjusting to society and was pretty much homeless for most of his life. And we got a tiny house built for him, and it has shifted his whole way that he looks at the world. He now has a place that is solid and secure and safe, and he can store his things, and he can go there and take a shower and cook a meal, and it's only 140 square feet. But it changed his life dramatically, and I think there's a huge piece of the population that this would do that for them as well. And so it gives the ownership aspect, which is such a big part of the American dream that we've been focused on so much of our lives, especially my age group, the baby boomers. So the nice thing about the tiny house too is that it's really scalable. You can do 100 square foot to get a room, and then as you stay out of the rent cycle, which is like in our county has gotten crazy, we're one of the toughest counties to find a place to rent right now, and the prices just keep going up. So it allows people to help people, it allows people to have ownership, and again, the scalability of it. You can start small, and you can do your first one out of salvaged materials, and then save money and be able to do other pieces of all this. What we're really excited about is creating villages and helping people to live more comfortably and live with each other and share space and be able to look at how they interact with other humans, because that's really, I get really engaged with technology and the building geek stuff and things like that, but you know, a lot of what our lives are about is how we interact with each other and how we really come together to start helping each other. And design really comes into that play, and it's not just about how something looks or what finish materials you have. It's more about how it feels. And design is not just about how it looks and how it feels. It's about how it works too. And so if your small space works really well, then it becomes even just that much richer. I lived on sailboats, anchored out at various places in my life, and sailboats are a great place to see where things can be multifunctional and how much can you do in square inches instead of square feet. And if you ever get a chance to play around on a nice sailboat or go to an in-the-water boat show, it's great lessons to be able to stroll around and look at some of those really beautifully done, beautifully crafted ships. And we joke around with the tiny house movement is that we just have land yachts, and we're just able to sail those when we want to or not and just stay anchored out. So the village scale that we're starting to look at right now is about 30 units. In the co-housing world, they talk a lot about 30 units being a really nice scale because you're small enough that you know all your neighbors and you interact. And if it gets to be more than that, then people start to splinter off into little side groups. So the social aspect of having a little grouping of houses that have a place like a central meeting place and a commercial kitchen and a meeting and a place where you can have gatherings and have guests come and stay, because frankly in your tiny house it gets pretty tight when you get guests involved. I think we're at a really interesting place in life where we can start to create new patterns of living together, because the patterns that we've had in the past for the past 30, 40, 50 years haven't really served a lot of people. We're no longer nuclear families all over the place. We're now a lot of individuals in many cases. And so, again, it really helps us look at how we live together, how we can help each other, how we as human animals can be more cooperative, which is really the basis of how we've survived so far. And it's a nice step forward, and it's fun being a piece of this whole movement. So it's you know, America's always been thought of as the great experiment, and I think this is just another phase of it. There are a couple of towns now, one in Texas, one in Colorado, who are now starting to make tiny homes legal and make it reasonable for you to be able to put your 100, 200, 300, 400 square foot house on a small piece of land and live comfortably and not be blown out by property taxes or having to do a minimum size requirement, which is what we run into a lot, and that's driven a lot by the mortgage and banking industry. But it's shifting times, and we need new ways to answer some of these questions that we have when we're developing as human animals, starting to get into.
Hey, Mark.
Yeah.
There was a question that came in here regarding sort of the I guess more technical aspects of designing for a passive house. You know, Chris talked a lot about different HVAC systems that they employ on commercial buildings. Is there anything fundamentally different, is the question, about designing HVAC, or I guess I'm going to add in things like envelope and insulation for a tiny house versus for even a normal house, let alone a bigger building?
Thanks, great question. Yes, there is. You know, you still want to have the same basic standards to do a good thermal envelope, and I've pushed that really hard in Jay's designs by, we use rigid foam a lot, which, you know, I have to wrestle with because of the petrochemical aspects of it, but I've also used a lot of the natural insulating materials, and frankly, I always come back to, you know, something, if I want to design and build something, I want it to last at least 50 years or a lot longer. And so things like putting dense petroleum products in the walls that do a fabulous job, like polyisocyanurate. I really like that foam because it's impervious to water, and we have so many moisture issues in our homes now. And if you get a good thermal envelope, it takes very little to heat it and cool it. One of the things that people are going to on the larger tiny homes now, if once they do get a good thermal envelope, spray foam is being used by some of the companies as well, is you can just put a small mini split in there and take care of your whole heating and cooling load really easily. It's the other thing too, you can glaze, and the kind of the fun thing that we joke about is you can have a solar building that you can have the glazed side facing to the north in the summertime, and then you can just literally spin it around in the summer or in the wintertime to get the passive solar gain and get the penetration deep into the structure. And so that answer your question well enough?
Yeah, I think that's helpful, Mark. Thanks.
And so, you know, one of the things that we come back to time and again in the tiny house world is, what are we really trying to do? You know, we're trying to provide shelter, shelter from the elements, basic human need. But we're also looking at personal security, space for making food, entertaining, having friends over, all the basic pieces of life that help us live a more fruitful and wonderful life. So it's a movement that's in its infancy. It's hit a couple of big walls right now that are being addressed, but I highly encourage all of you, especially now while you're still in school, get out and get some hands-on experience. Like, you know, when they did the solar Decathlon house 2 years ago, that's a fabulous experience that even with all my building experience, never got to do anything quite that fabulous as far as a zero energy home. We're just starting to get into that now. You know, California's put some good laws into place to move us along that way, but we still have so many structures that are in need of retrofit. And so how do you look at an existing structure as well and start to bring it into the 21st century and be able to do some of those things like heat it and cool it passively with the sun, and be able to have a reasonable utility bill and be able to have a nice, comfortable home without having a lot of being totally tied to the grid and having to pump all sorts of external energy into it, which obviously has its own layers out of damage and so forth that it does. So, you know, I've been really fortunate to go on kind of a wild and wonderful ride from when I got out of school. It was in the late 70s, mid-late 70s, and it was not a lot going on. Energy efficiency was just starting to get talked about. California adopted Title 24 in the late 70s and started moving in that direction. And I always tell people that I like them to be able to step back far enough to be able to see not only their own structure, but how it fits into the bigger context of things and how it fits into it's how much it's taking from the earth every time that you operate it. And so the bigger carbon footprint of your structure, what's in the materials, what's in the operations, looking at the big picture and seeing how you can, you know, like Chris was talking about how they ran into the economics of the chilled beam. A lot of times, if it's profit driven, like with a developer, it's really challenging because you have to make those numbers work in our context now. But if you're designing something for yourself that you're going to live in for a long period of time or have for a long period of time, it a lot of times makes sense to spend more upfront to be able to have that better material like the polyiso versus the styrofoams or even the fiberglass insulation that's going to perform better and give you so much more back over the long haul. So in the design mind, it's about taking the big picture and looking at the whole outlook of things. And there were a couple of books that really like turned my world upside down back in the 70s. And one of them was a book called Shelter, which I'll hold up here. Is this showing okay?
Yeah, we can see it.
So this was done in the early 70s and has been updated some, but basically it looks at indigenous shelter throughout the world and is just a fabulous travelogue of things that are being done and have been done traditionally. And it's a place to start to be able to look at how you can interface with the world and what things work for you. And you know, it's fun to be able to, if you can get a piece of semi-rural land where you can pretty much make it an art project. That's another way to sort of play around with the code aspect of things is you just tell people you're doing some art. And the other one that really influenced me was the Whole Earth catalog, which is now out of print and long gone in many ways, but the editor of that, who went on to actually be the founding member and editor of Wired magazine as well, is a guy by the name of Kevin Kelly. And he now has a publication, and he has a couple of websites. One's called Cool Tools, and then this is also the Whole Earth catalog, oversized book edition of that same animal. And it's fascinating. It's just the topics, it covers a little bit of everything. And you can get lost in this for hours, as I do many times. And there's just so many great resources out there now that are available to you, not even including the web. But, you know, I'm sort of old school, so I still like my books. So anybody have any questions that they'd like to throw out there?
There is a question, Mark, and first off, thanks. And I would actually second Mark's recommendation of the Cool Tools website. If you get a chance to go play around with that, there's some really interesting different things they've got up there. But yeah, so this is a question that Maya asked last week that I want to bring up again because I think it's very appropriate with the end of your conversation here, Mark. And last week we were talking about new buildings, and the question that Maya asked was, well, how do we rectify constructing new buildings and the embodied energy, the embodied materials, especially as you're talking about things like polyiso, which, as you acknowledge, come from plastics, from oil-based resources. So how do we square the sort of the broader impact of that with the idea that there are unused spaces currently that perhaps we could be reusing existing building infrastructure? And then I want to add on one more piece of this, which is that you started out by saying that you've done a lot with alternative building materials, which is actually the topic of our lecture next week. And yet here, when you're talking about the tiny houses, again, you're talking about a lot of things that are more traditional building materials or more, polyiso, those sorts of things. So yeah, if you could talk a little bit about, the difference between that new build versus trying to reuse, which may be harder with tiny houses, and then the difference from a maybe building science perspective on the alternative versus these other more synthetic materials.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let me talk about materials a little bit. The tiny house movement has really brought about really supported the makers world, and a lot of people are doing things totally out of salvaged materials. There are a lot of great examples on the web of people who have done their house for $5,000 or $10,000 in materials because they've gone and scavenged and salvaged. You can sometimes pick things up really easily from just by going to building sites and asking if you can go through their dumpster and get things that are not useful to them but might be to others, might be to you. The alternative stuff is really sweet, and I really love playing with cob and straw bale and things like that. In the tiny house movement, especially since we're focusing a lot on putting things on trailers, there has to be a certain amount of conventional construction taking place just to be able so that they can go down the road when and if they need to. I also like to talk about the tiny house movement in two pieces. People who actually want to take their house and travel with it. I'm not a great fan of that. I think if you want to travel and do tiny house type things, get an Airstream, get an old one, restore it. For the tiny houses themselves, the wheel aspect of it, I see my tiny house maybe moving a couple of times in the rest of my life and not being meant to go down the road. So I would recommend using things like more traditional type construction techniques. Now, if you have a site and a beautiful piece of land and you want to do something, things like cob or such community building and straw bale, and you get such great thermal envelopes, and they're a lot of fun to play with. It all depends. It comes back to your site and what your long-range plans are. And so, I'm sorry, what was the first part of that again, Rob?
It was about sort of the embodied energy of new construction versus reusing existing built infrastructure.
Right. I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the future. When you start doing the calcs on embodied energy of new materials and then looking at old buildings, I think there's going to be a lot of office space or even old strip malls or things like that, especially as the population ages and we need more senior type housing. I think you're going to see a lot more of that type of taking structures like that and renovating them. There's a great book by the guy who started the Whole Earth Catalog, Stuart Brand, called How Buildings Learn. And it talks exactly about that, about how a building will change function and be changed in its structure and how it's reconfigured to meet new demands and serve new purposes.
Great. Well, thank you for those insightful answers, Mark. And with that, I think we are pretty much out of time. I do want to respect everybody's evening, especially those on the East Coast who are now at 9 o'clock. But I couldn't help could not have cut you off early, Mark. This is both you and Chris provide some really good experience, I think, for our students today. And so, again, thank you very much, Mark. Thank you, Chris. We really appreciate you guys taking the time to be here with us today. So with that, we are at the end of our hour. I want to leave you just with one last thing, and that is for next week, we're going to have our last lecture, and that's going to be with Erin Lennox. She is Dr. Erin Lennox, I should say. She is one of our projects directors here for ESW, and she's going to be talking exactly about what Mark touched on at the very end there, alternative building materials and some different, more historic, very historic types of architecture that can help us achieve low-energy buildings. So there are 3 things posted on the syllabus now, 2 articles, and an interesting TED Talk that Erin would like you guys to take a look at in advance of next week. And again, as always, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email, send Karen or Erin emails, and we're happy to address those between now and next Thursday. So otherwise, thank you guys so much for being here, and thanks again, Mark and Chris. We really appreciate your time, and have a great evening, everyone.